Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. In the last episode, we had bombs falling down on England every day, and yet the spirit of the people and the king and the queen didn't waver. So let's see what they're up to today. The queen went to Glamis, and Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret wrote to her, giving her news of what was going on from Windsor. Their education continued under the governess, and Princess Elizabeth was almost 15 and was being taught history from Henry Martin. Marion Crawford wrote to Queen Mary that Mr. Martin saw great stuff in his pupil and thought she could compare very well with the Etonians a year older than she was. Both princesses loved the piano and entertained the household with duets. Miss Crawford wrote that, and then she felt that Princess Margaret had developed wonderfully. She was a companion for Princess Elizabeth, and she was a joy to teach, always asking questions. The two princesses did well in French, and at family lunches they spoke only French to their governess. Marion Crawford told Queen Mary, "The children are happy and well, and having knowledge poured in as fast as I can pour it in." The Queen started to become worried that the visits she and the King were making to the bombed towns were attracting more German attacks. They had been to Plymouth, which was heavily bombed, and on their way back to London by train, Queen Elizabeth said the foul Germans made a very heavy attack on the town and dockyard. "What brutes they are! I am certain that they first go to the working-class houses, hoping to break the spirit of our people." The Queen wrote that to Lady Astor, MP for the Plymouth, to say, "Every time this sort of murderous attack is made, we feel as if our own children are being hurt. All we can do is to do our very best and leave the rest in God's hands." The war continued going on badly. The German U-boats in the Atlantic sank 500,000 tons of British shipping in March 1941 alone. Louis Mountbatten lost his destroyer, HMS Kelly, in the Mediterranean during the evacuation of Crete. The blitz continued, especially against the ports where convoys were berthed. Shortages grew worse and worse. 1 egg and a few ounces of meat were the standard ration. Cigarettes could still be bought, but alcohol was hard to find. Heating fuel and petrol for cars was short, clothing was rationed, people were cold, and sometimes even Churchill was depressed. The Balkans became a concern. In the spring of 1941, Hitler demanded that Prince Paul, the regent of Yugoslavia, allow German troops to march through Yugoslavia to conquer Greece. King George VI tried to reason with him, but the prince felt he had no alternative, and at the end of March 1941, he signed a pact with the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan. By the end of May, the entire peninsula was in fascist hands. Prince Paul and Princess Olga went into exile, first in Greece, then in Kenya, and spent the rest of the war in South Africa. King George II of Greece escaped and went to London. Prince Paul's conduct saddened the king and queen, whose friend he had been for so long. Queen Mary was shocked that he had behaved as he did. The queen reported that she felt sorry for him. He made such a mess of his job in the eyes of the world, and that after struggling with immense difficulties for some very unhappy years for himself. She said he was very timorous, insensitive, and subtle-minded. Things have gotten too serious in the world for any country to sign a pact with Germany and yet be pro-English or neutral. It just doesn't work, and he must have known it. The Queen continued to make visits and to raise morale around the country. In early 1941, she saw the 2nd Canadian Division, the WVS Salvage Centers in Paddington, the American Eagle Club in Charing Cross Road, London police stations, bombed areas of East and West Ham, New Scotland Yard, the Red Cross, the British Legion Conference, the Staff College at Camberley, and the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, the London Auxiliary Ambulance Service of the County Hall, the RAF Aerodromes of Bomber Command. They were a battalion of the London Scottish and Sussex, war factories in the north end of England, the Glider Training Squadron, and the Maurice Community Club in Hoxton. On one of her visits, someone said that when the car stops, the Queen nips out in the snow and goes straight into the middle of the crowd and starts talking to them. For a moment or two, they just gaze and gape in astonishment, but then they all started talking to her at once. "Hi, Your Majesty, look here." She has a quality of making everybody feel that they are alone and being spoken to. The relationship between the King and Queen and Churchill became even closer. Churchill wrote to the King that he was cheered by their weekly luncheons in poor bomb-battered Buckingham Palace. At the lunches they talked about the other subjects besides war. The Queen impressed Churchill by sending him the lines from Wordsworth in early 1940, and he realized that the pleasure she took in the spoken and written word. He gave her a copy of H.W. Fowler's Dictionary of Modern English Usage. May 6, 1941, Churchill went to the palace to say there was an operation to get more tanks and aircraft to General Wavell in Egypt. They were needed at once, and Churchill was planning to send them by the risky route through the Mediterranean to Alexandria. It was a risk worth taking. The king recorded that the operation had been safely completed and that 250 tanks and 50 aircraft had arrived in Alexandria. One ship with 50 tanks on board had struck a mine and sunk in the Narrows. May 10th, London suffered another gigantic raid by 400 bombers. On that one night, almost 1,500 people were killed, 1,800 were injured, 2,000 fires were started, and 11,000 houses were burned to rubble. Both houses of Parliament were hit. Part of the Waterloo station was destroyed. Bow Street Church was flattened. Westminster Abbey was damaged too. By June, over 2 million British homes were destroyed, more than half of them in London. Air raid shelters for the homeless were getting better, and the Queen noticed that the bigger ones on the East End had bunks and running water, and that the social services had improved as well. The Queen and the King wondered what would happen to the people after the war, when the people wanted to go back to areas like Stepney, which had been completely destroyed. They were overcrowded before the war, but new houses would take time to build. The Queen felt that there would be many difficult moments. Life, though, in many ways continued as normally as possible. Mail was delivered, trains ran, streets were swept, taxis were asking for drivers, telephones worked, restaurants stayed open, and so did the nightclubs. Weddings were often celebrated in churches that had no roofs. Shattered shop windows were restored or boarded. The Queen had a link in the United States. Her youngest brother, David, he was posted to the British Embassy in Washington. His mission was to create a political warfare executive in both Washington and New York. He had a good relationship with President Roosevelt, as well as the ambassador, Lord Halifax, and was a useful personal and independent channel of information for the King and Queen. Like every other Briton in the States, he saw his task as trying to persuade the President and the American people that much more should be done to support the British war effort. Queen Elizabeth agreed to make a radio broadcast to the women of America, and it would be more acceptable at that time because she was able to thank the many Americans who were actively helping the war effort and in giving medical supplies. And she made the speech out and sent it to Churchill for his advice, adding, "I fear it is not very polished, a good deal of my own." Churchill made suggestions, and the broadcast went out August 10, 1941. It was effective. President Roosevelt wrote at once to the King, asking him to tell her that the broadcast was really perfect in every way and that it would do a great amount of good. The Queen's 41st birthday was spent at Windsor. Queen Mary sent her good wishes and prayers for peace and victory, and that you may be given health and strength to carry on the help and comfort you have given to so many since the war started. You have given so much help, too, to my and your dear Bertie, help for which I shall ever be grateful as your joint loving Mama. The Queen and her daughters were able to get to Scotland for a welcome holiday in the second half of August 1941. The King joined them a few days later. The Queen loved being in the sharp, fresh air, seeing her daughters and husband relax and walking in the hills. She thought her daughters were looking 10 times better after a few days. They had pink cheeks and good appetites. The Queen told her eldest daughter years later that Balmoral was such a very happy house, and I remember thinking, when we came up in those awful days of 1941 and 1942, how clean it felt, in a way pure, and she said that she felt that way now. Mackenzie King, the Canadian Prime Minister, came to stay for 2 nights and wrote in his diary that they had lunch in a little cottage across the moors. There was no staff, and the princesses laid the table and decorated it with lettuce leaves. He found Princess Elizabeth very sweet and natural in her conversation, and Margaret entertaining. She would cross her eyes to amuse the company, and the Queen told her to stop doing that for fear that they might become fixed in that position, and the King had to tell her the same thing. From Balmoral, they returned south to the stress and destruction. By the end of the year, they were living more at Buckingham Palace. Tragedy struck the Queen's family, too. Her nephew, John, Master of Glamis, son of her eldest brother Patrick, was killed in action on September 1941 in Egypt. while serving with the Scots Guards. The Queen was listening to the radio in her room when she heard the news about the bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. It was December the 7th, 1941. She told the king the news and said it can't be true. Then she realized that America would now at last enter the war. Next day, both houses of Congress declared war on Japan, and Britain did the same. Hitler then declared war on the United States, and this was his biggest single mistake of the war. The king sent a telegram of sympathy to President Roosevelt, now the leader of Britain's most important ally. The Queen felt it would take the United States time to learn total war methods, which those horrid Japanese had much used. She said she felt sorry for them, though they have persistently closed their eyes to such evident danger, for they are a very young and untried nation. While the King and Queen were in Wales, the secretary took a call, and he told him that two of Britain's principal ships, the battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse, had been sunk by Japanese planes off the coast of Thailand. The Queen said that a half a century later that it was a dreadful blow. I'd never forgotten that. The loss of the two great ships cast the country into despair. The King and Queen felt a horror about it too. Many of the crewmen were saved, but more than 800 were lost. This news killed any joy over America getting into the war. The Queen decided to have a painting done of Windsor Castle by artist John Piper at her request. His watercolors were controversial at the time, but they were immediately recognized as, and remain today. It showed Britain at war, the age-old fortress of the monarch standing strong against the forces of darkness. The bombardment of London in 1940 and 1941 inspired her to do it. She feared that it might be destroyed by the Germans. In the second half of her life, she hung up Piper's paintings prominently in her London home and showed them to visitors with pleasure. The royal family spent the first 3 weeks in 1942 at Appleton House near Sandringham. While they were there, the Queen received her first ever food parcel. It was from J.P. Morgan, the American banker, who had shot with them before the war. She wrote and thanked him, explaining that the cheese had caused the greatest stir and would always be most welcome, as they never had any themselves, feeling it would be kept for the industrial workers. She feared it would be a long time before they would meet again in the hills of Scotland, but somehow the world seems to have balanced itself better with the United States in the fight against evil thinking and evil doing. The first half of 1942 was terrible for the Allies. German U-boats sank more and more American and British ships in the North Atlantic. And in February 1942, the German naval command was able to run 3 heavy warships out of Brest and right up to the Channel home into the German waters despite sustained air assault upon them. Malaysia was overrun by the Japanese. Singapore surrendered to the enemy on February the 15th. 80,000 British soldiers were taken prisoner. The King and Queen were feeling the effects of all the bad news. The Queen told Queen Mary, "Bertie and I have been very tired and troubled of late." She insisted on keeping the faith. One must have confidence in the good sense and wonderful fighting spirit of this wonderful people of ours. So I will end the video here. In this episode, we have seen the people and the King and the Queen trying to lead normal lives, even though they were being regularly bombed and destruction was all around. In the normal living, there was comfort having the mail still come, trains run, taxis, nightclubs open, etc. There were rations on clothes and food, and the English kept their optimistic attitudes even so. Churchill and the King and the Queen grew closer, and that helped to keep their morals up. Then came the attack of Pearl Harbor on the United States by the Japanese, and that got America into the war. Things didn't go well at first, but soon things were going to change. But I hope everybody enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated and would help my channel out. I recently decided to add Amazon products in my description, so if you would like to see any of those, just go there in my description. And if you see anything you want, just click on the link and it'll lead you to the page. If you decide to buy anything, I just get a small commission, and it's no extra charge for you to do that. And so I end by saying I hope everybody's been having a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Thank you. Bye.